So I've already made a video on how to get a 9 in English literature, and you can check that video out if you haven't already. It's in the corner in the top right of the screen. But I want to go into a bit more detail in exactly what I did to achieve that grade 9 and how you can fully master English literature, because there are a lot of tips that I still want to go over that I didn't properly mention in my first video. So I hope that this video kind of gives you a bit more detail in what you should exactly do for your exam, not only now but when it comes to the day before your exam as well. Without wasting any more of your time, let's just get straight into the first tip. My first tip is to have less quotations but more explanations. Now, before I start this one, I do have a poem that I would like to read. Students, without hesitation, put lots of quotations but little explanation. You see, the key information lies in the interpretation, not the regurgitation. Thank you for listening to my poem. That's the end of the video. Bye. I'm just kidding. Basically, what I mean from that, if you analyze my poem that I just made off the spot in like 2 seconds, is that a lot of people, including me back in like year 10, I used to put so many quotations in. I think people put too much focus on learning as many quotations. I remember people kept on coming up to me and going, how many quotations should I learn? 50, 100, 200? Like, it's not about how many quotations you learn, it's about what you can do with the quotations that you already know. Back in my GCSEs, I would basically pick out quotations from every single one of my texts that I understood the most and I could use in a variety of different ways. Throughout my course, when the teacher explained us different parts, I would be highlighting different areas of it, and if I just open it up to like a random page, not much highlighting, but it's still highlighting nonetheless. And the reason for this is now I've got so many quotations to work with. Obviously there's so many quotations, I put this all into one massive Google Doc. I wasn't going to memorize all of them, I just wanted to pick out the ones I could use in a variety of different ways. For Inspector Cause, my structure was 3 paragraphs. It doesn't really matter how you structure your paragraphs as long as you have paragraphs and those paragraphs clearly have as much explanation as you could possibly put in them. I think one thing our teacher used to always tell us is if you put explanation into your quotations, put more, and if you think you've got enough, put even more, because the more explanations you have, the more things the examiner can mark you on. So one way I would recommend to do that is by watching lots of videos on different people analysing different quotations, and it's really important to, I will touch on videos a bit later on in this video as well, but it's really important to get one quotation that you know pretty well and see different perspectives of that quotation. One thing I've realized that got me a lot of marks was when I would put a quotation in and I would show different ways you could interpret it. So I would say, on the one hand, you could see this quotation as this, but it could also be interpreted as this. I'd show different like sides of just one quotation. That way I'd have more to talk about from that quotation. I would have more things to talk about, and it would just make it more robust, if that makes sense, because the entire thing, it's got more explanations. Obviously, it's important to learn a lot of quotations because it gives you more leeway in terms of which ones you can use, but don't make that your main target. Try and make sure that you know how to analyze the quotations that you know. And in terms of analysis, the best thing you can do is pick quotations that have like metaphors, similes, whatever, something that you can easily talk about and relate to the question itself. For example, for the poems, it's good to try and pick out 2 poems that have similar techniques and then talk about how those similar techniques are used in different ways. For example, if you're trying to portray something that's different, because that way you can compare them and also show how they're different at the same time. So that's one thing you can do. And in terms of analyzing a quotation, what you're actually meant to write after you wrote a quotation, obviously the quotation has to be embedded, which if you don't know how to do, ask your teacher. It's very important to embed your quotations. You can literally just say a specific word in that phrase that could give some sort of meaning that you could talk about, but don't use the word. What I mean by that is, like, let's assume you're analysing a quotation and it's got the word excited in it, right? Don't say the word excited shows. Instead, say something like the adjective excited. It just sounds nicer if you try and use synonyms for the word show. That's another thing that my teacher had told us. They gave us like a list of a good like 50 different replacements for the word show. So that could be like communicates, illustrates, whatever it is, just something that's not the word show. It just makes the entire essay just feel a lot better and a bit more professional, and that could just subconsciously make the examiner feel like the essay is slightly better. And I know that's kind of weird, but the whole way that English Lit and Lang is marked is just, it's not going to be in your favor most of the time. And a lot of the times when you come to GCSE exam season, you get your grades and you're like, oh, okay, that's not what I was expecting. Sometimes it can be pleasant surprise, or it could be an unpleasant surprise. But I mean, that's just something about English that you can't really predict, and that's why some people, when they go for a remark, the grade changes drastically. I want to also talk about the sponsor of today's video, First Rate Tutors, because they are such an effective learning platform. We have videos on virtually everything on the GCSE specification, whether it's on learning grade 9 model answers or even just the basics such as like similes and metaphors and trying to get used to those. This website, First Rate Tutors, not only has model answers, but it has videos accompanying them in great detail where they go over just exactly how those model answers are written and why those model answers actually work. This course has everything you need on both English literature and English language. So if you're struggling on your poems, it has that. If you're struggling on how to write a question 5 for paper 1 in English language, it's got that as well. It's got every single thing you could think of in English literature and English language, whether it's even the speaking assessment as well. It's got tips on that too. It's literally just a one-off purchase, so after you've purchased it, you can have peace of mind knowing that you don't have any sort of monthly subscription that you need to stick to. And what's very unique about this website is the fact that it's very self-paced and it's all based on your own preferences. So make sure you check it out. It's in the description and the pinned comment down below. And yeah, let's just get straight back on with the video. The second tip I do want to say, that was all one massive tip, is a plan before you write. This is so important, and if you don't do this, I don't know why you're not doing this. It's so important to have a sort of plan before you actually start whatever essay you're doing. So for example, I would show you my past essays that I did in my book, but I threw away my English book and I heavily regret it because that's probably the one book that I want to always refer back to. The only one I have is this one from GCSE mocks, which I will share down below in the description if you guys want to check it out. But for my poetry anthology, and this isn't the best of essays, so don't be too harsh on me, but somehow I managed to get 27 out of 30 for the essay for the poetry. I was comparing Remains and Bayonet Charge, right, and I put both poems alongside, and then I just put what quotations I'm going to use. That was literally the plan, and a plan can be as basic as that, or it can be as detailed as putting exactly what you're going to say about each quotation, but don't make it too detailed because this is a plan. You're just trying to show that you know what you're going to be doing for the essay. That's the point of a plan, because if you don't do a plan, you're not going to know where to get through and you're going to get lost. Before I started every single one of my GCSE English Lit exams, every single one of my essays, right before I started it, I wrote down as many quotations as I could remember, and then in my plan I put the ones I was going to use, and that way I didn't have to worry about remembering quotations because I had already written them all down, and so I was at peace in terms of that one aspect for the rest of the exam for that. Now, in terms of writing essays, I have mentioned that writing essays is super important for both English literature and language, but another really important thing is to, after you've written your essay and have had it marked, is to track them, which I did do before GCSEs, but right afterwards I just threw them away, which is completely fine. If you want to burn your books, that's completely fine, like you well deserve it, but before your GCSEs, make sure you keep every single one of your essays that you do and see exactly where you're going wrong and see exactly where the like red pens are and see where you're not doing as well and see what the main aspects you're missing. And a lot of the times your teacher would put targets for you at the end of every essay, so always try and make sure that the next time you write an essay you actually follow those targets, and then you'll slowly see an increase in your overall grade in the subject. The amount of essays I wrote for my GCSEs was I just remember how stressful it was, and it's hard work, but the hard work pays off, trust me. You're gonna see a slow increase in your overall mark, and if you don't see that increase, you need to go to your teacher and ask how you can do better, because if you're not seeing any sort of increase in your essays, it's pointless. You need to be able to see that you're doing something well and you're actually applying the advice that your teacher's given you, or whoever that's marking your essay. You need some sort of improvement, because otherwise something's going wrong. So it is important to make sure that you are improving, or at least learning from your past mistakes, and so that way the next essay that you write is going to be better than the one before, and so on. I talked about explanation, but another thing to really hone in about is context. It really depends on what text you're doing for context, but generally context is very important. Something like this over here, this context is literally the entire essay. You need to put so much context in a text like this, but for something like poems you don't need that much context. But it is always important to throw in as much context as you can, know everything about the author, okay, not everything, but just know a few facts about each poet, about each author, and just be able to always sprinkle them in. It gives the impression that you know what you're talking about. For example, if you're talking about a poem, to be able to say why this poem was written, you don't need to put in exact figures and dates, but just having an overall idea of what the backstory was for each poem, or for example, why each book was written. Why is a very important question to ask whenever you're doing an essay. Always firstly, constantly be linking back to the question, and seeing how what you're saying is going back towards the question, how it's answering it. But the other thing that you need to do is why. Why does the author or the poet or whatever do what they're doing? Whenever you write in a quotation, make sure you are answering the question with that quotation, and then you're also explaining why that quotation is there. You have to try and say why it exists. Like, what's the point of having this quotation? Or you might not actually believe that the quotation needed to exist in the first place, but just pretend like you're interested, pretend like you know what you're saying, and you'll get far. So the way I used to structure most of my essays was I would have my point, right? So this is like basic stuff. You'd have your point, you'd have the quotation, the embedded quotation, then you'd have a bit of explanation. But I realized over time that a bit of explanation should be a lot of explanation, because that's the main part where you get the marks. And then put context in. You can sprinkle the context over the explanation, or you can put the context separately below the explanation itself. But I personally like interleaving them, so to constantly be talking about context, it just shows that you know what you're doing. And yeah, context, very important to make sure that you have more explanation than context, because context is important, but it's nowhere near as important as the actual explanation itself, because a lot of the times context doesn't actually answer the question, it just adds to it. And also with context, you should always try and link it back to the reader or to the audience or whatever. You're always trying to show how this relates back to the people who are reading it at the time, or the people who are like being affected by it at the time. That's another way to really put in context. Now, I did touch on videos. Videos are so important. I mean, there are so many YouTubers, Mr. Bruff, Mr. Sals, Mr. Everything English. There's so many. Watch every single one of their like analysis videos and be able to have many perspectives of several quotations. As I have mentioned before, it's very important to be able to explain one quotation in many different ways. And one thing I remember doing day before my exam for my English Lit was sitting there watching a Mr. Sal's video and eating breakfast. And trust me, it helped so much. Mr. Everything English, he was a lifesaver back in 2022. He's amazing. And Mr. Bruff was really good as well. So all three of them, they were the main ones I used in terms of like YouTubers that you could watch their videos on. It's just like generally just watching videos, it helps build up that knowledge. And the more and more videos you watch, the more familiar you become with the quotations and the text themselves, which is also very important, because you need to be able to know your text inside out. And one way I did that was to, before I go to bed, to just read a few pages of it, which sounds sad. It is sad, but it helps. It genuinely helps. It is important to know your quotations inside out, but also know your text inside out, and just know what's going on and where. You have a better idea of the entire poem or the entire book or whatever it is that you're studying. Okay, on my top 10 list of things that I always constantly make a mistake on, I would say don't be vague is probably up there in like the top 3, because vagueness is something I do all the time. And what I mean by that, if you even check my sample model essay that I talked about down below in the description, I am someone who likes to be very vague. You know, the words like great impact on the reader, or like it's very significant but I don't say why it's significant. Those type of things the examiners do not like. Do not put them in your essay, please. Like, just don't, because they don't give anything away. It's just there to like fill some lines up. You need to always, so one thing I used to do a lot of the time is whenever I'm comparing something, right, I would be like, the poem this and this, explore whatever the theme is in a lot of different ways, but I don't say what those different ways are. You need to be able to say that in the same sentence, otherwise it would count as being vague. Put adjectives that go toward the question and be able to explain everything in context to what you're talking about. Otherwise you're just being vague and it's just pointless what you're saying. So like avoid words like impact or like this is significant, because that doesn't add to anything. It's very important to not be vague. That's just it. I mean, I don't really know what else to say on that. Like, just don't be vague, please. Now, the last tip I have is on unseen poetry, because this is something that a lot of people stress about unnecessarily. Just remember that you don't need to talk about the techniques. You can literally just talk about the words. You can literally just do that and you can still get a really good mark. But usually with these unseen poems, they just throw in a handful of different things. Don't think that because you can't find a simile there that you're screwed, because there will be other techniques. And this is why it's very important to become familiar with your techniques, so you don't just stick to similes and metaphors, and you can find all sorts of different ones. Because if you talk about complex techniques and have good explanation for it, which is the important part, then your entire writing just seems so much better. So yeah, if you know those complicated techniques, then they're so much better than your average simile and metaphor. But at the same time, talking about similes and metaphors, or even just words, is still good enough. And I think it's something that people overlook. It's just as important talking about the way a specific adjective has been used compared to the way anaphor has been used. So it literally just depends on what you find. And as long as you find anything that you can talk about and relate it back to the question, you're fine. It's not that bad. I have an unseen poetry model answer as well in that same Google Doc PDF thing, whatever it is. So you can check that out as well down below in the description too. And I also have down below in the description an Inspector Course condensed quotations list as well if you need that. And I have a few more resources that you can check down below as well. And yeah, that's it. That's literally it for my tips on how to master English Lit. So I hope you found this video useful. And as always, if you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments or email me at this email right here. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Make sure you check out First Rate Tutors, and I'll see you again next time. Bye for now.